Hey guys, tonight we step straight into the rigid and unforgiving world of feudal Japan, the long era stretching from 1192, when the Kamakura shogunate began, to 1868, when the Tokugawa shogunate collapsed and the Meiji Restoration dragged the country toward modernity. Imagine yourself in a provincial village during the year 1605, the era when Tokugawa Ieyasu had just consolidated power. The smell of smoke curls out of low, thatched roof homes. The clang of a blacksmith's hammer echoes somewhere beyond the rice paddies, and in the distance the watchful eye of a samurai patrol keeps the entire community in order. You might think the view of Mount Fuji framed by cherry blossoms is picturesque, but don't relax too soon. If you happen to be a woman here, every one of those blossoms is a reminder of fragility, brevity, and how society values you only in relation to men. You probably won't survive this night without losing freedom, dignity, or both. If you're curious about the darker side of Japanese history, stay tuned. This is the unspeakable suffering of women in feudal Japan. Hit like if you're already unsettled, subscribe if you want more midnight dives into the strange corners of the past, and drop a comment telling me your location and local time. I want to know from which corner of the world you're listening while the ghosts of samurai hover in the background. And now, lean back, breathe deep, and let's begin this long, unsettling story. From the very beginning of Japan's feudal system, the place of women was defined not by their individuality, but by an iron framework of social hierarchy. At the top of society stood the shogun, backed by powerful daimyo who ruled regional domains. Beneath them, the samurai class enforced law and custom, carrying blades with the privilege of life and death over commoners. Below samurai were the farmers, who produced the rice tax that kept the entire system afloat. Then came artisans, then merchants, disdained but necessary, and finally those considered outcast, including entertainers and the impoverished. Where did women fit? They slotted into every class but with the same baseline expectation: obedience. Confucian ideals, imported from China centuries earlier, cemented this framework. Think of the 3 obediences drilled into girls from the moment they could walk. Obey your father before marriage, your husband once married, and your son if widowed. A woman's place was cast as forever subordinate, a shadow to whichever man dominated her life. There was no official path to authority except through attachment to a male figure. Even in rare cases where a woman inherited lands, guardianship by a male relative often stripped her of autonomy. The samurai code, or bushido, often gets painted as a noble set of ethics guiding warriors toward honor. But hidden inside its pages was an implicit command for women: maintain purity, loyalty, and silence. While men were celebrated for acts of bravery or even ritual suicide, women were applauded only for bearing sons and serving quietly. The same hand that polished a katana or arranged a tea ceremony could also strike a wife across the face without fear of interference, because the family unit was considered a miniature fortress under the husband's absolute rule. Legal codes reinforced this. Take the Honor Daigaku, or Greater Learning for Women, a Tokugawa-era instructional text. It reads like a manual for permanent servitude. A woman must look to her husband as her lord, and must serve him with all worship and reverence. To modern ears it sounds suffocating, but in its time it was just another recitation of normal life. A girl learned to bow deeper, speak softer, and keep her eyes lowered, because those small gestures were rehearsals for a lifetime of obedience. Consider what this meant for daily experience. A boy born to a farming family might dream of becoming a samurai retainer or, at the very least, managing his family's land. A girl of the same household might learn how to carry water jugs that weighed nearly as much as she did, balance them across her shoulders, and then grow up to serve not only her husband but her husband's parents too. There was no upward trajectory, no ladder to climb, just the quiet grind of work, childbearing, and the constant threat of punishment for stepping out of the line. Punishment, by the way, was not considered an abuse but an educational tool. If a girl failed to prepare rice properly, if she laughed too loudly, or if she spoke when her husband wished silence, discipline could come swiftly. Families believed that a disobedient wife shamed not only her husband but his entire lineage. You, as a woman in this world, were never judged as an individual. You were a living representation of family honor. Slip up, and dishonor rippled outward like a stone in a pond. That expectation carried into every social stratum. At the imperial court in Kyoto, aristocratic women were clothed in dazzling layers of silk, with hair trailing across the tatami mats. Yet beneath all the elegance lay the same Confucian backbone. Women were ornamental, valued for beauty, musical skill, or their ability to write delicate poetry that might flatter a husband. Samurai wives, wrapped in practical kimono rather than 12 layers, bore the same chains. Peasant women bent over rice paddies bore them too. From palace to hut, the melody was the same: humility, obedience, silence. Even religion provided little escape. Buddhism, which emphasized attachment and transcendence, often taught that women's bodies were inherently defiled, obstacles to enlightenment. Shinto shrines, dedicated to kami spirits, sometimes gave space to female priestesses, but their role diminished over time. By the Edo period, female spiritual authority had withered, replaced by clerical hierarchies dominated by men. Instead of sanctuary, temples and shrines reinforced the message that women must endure suffering as their natural lot. Now imagine yourself as a teenage girl in the early 1600s. From childhood, you've been told stories of loyalty and sacrifice. You're reminded that your body is a vessel to carry heirs, your mind a mirror to reflect obedience, and your voice something to be heard only in song or prayer. Your father is already negotiating with another family about your future husband, though you're still playing with dolls carved from wood scraps. The adults don't hide it. You are property, a coin to be traded for alliances or stability. You can hear the grown-ups counting the value of your body as if tallying sacks of rice. Society often praises the cherry blossom as a symbol of beauty because it falls at the peak of perfection, short-lived and delicate. In this analogy, women were cherry blossoms, adored while young but quickly cast aside once petals fell. Unlike the blossom, though, you couldn't drift peacefully to the ground. You had to continue working, serving and obeying, long after beauty faded. What makes this harsher is the absence of protection. Today, if you faced mistreatment, you might expect neighbours, elders, or courts to intervene. In feudal Japan, the family was sovereign. A husband beating his wife was seen not as a crime, but as a household affair. If you were a wife in Edo in 1650, and your husband decided you'd been disrespectful, he could confine you to a locked storeroom without food. Neighbours would shake their heads, not at him, but at you for bringing shame upon yourself. The texts of the time reinforced this. Manuals on household management advised women to accept chastisement gratefully, as an opportunity to improve themselves. The good wife, according to one samurai handbook, was like a mirror without dust, meaning her surface reflected her husband's will perfectly, without distortion. Any scratch, any hint of independence, was a flaw. It's easy to romanticize samurai dramas, with their stoic warriors and serene wives arranging flowers. But beneath the silence of ikebana or the grace of tea ceremony lay women trained to efface themselves completely. Every bow, every sip, every petal placed in a vase was another practice session in erasing their own desires. One might ask, were there exceptions? Occasionally, yes. Some women wielded authority in the absence of male relatives or took up arms when their homes were threatened. But these exceptions were framed not as models for all women, but as anomalies, almost embarrassments to the carefully balanced hierarchy. Once the emergency passed, the expectation was to return to silence. So here you are, standing at the threshold of feudal Japan. Your entire world is bounded by men's authority, reinforced by Confucian maxims, Buddhist teachings, samurai codes, and legal structures. You're taught that your highest virtue is not to shine, but to dim yourself, so the men around you can blaze. It is obedience that defines you, silence that protects you, and endurance that marks your worth. Even laughter must be measured, even joy controlled, because every expression is weighed against the scales of family honor. And if you imagine resisting, if you imagine raising your voice, you might remember the samurai's privilege of kirisut gomen, the right to strike down anyone who disrespected them. For a man, that meant a foolish merchant or an insolent peasant. For a woman, it meant any misstep could be labelled dishonor, with punishment swift and merciless. You live under constant watch, not just from your family, but from the entire community, each ready to condemn you for failing to be the perfect shadow. That is the world you inherit in feudal Japan. No matter your class, your fate begins with subordination, reinforced by every text, law, and ritual. And while cherry blossoms bloom for only a few days each spring, Your obedience is expected to last a lifetime. Marriage in feudal Japan was never about romance, affection, or personal choice. From the very start, it was viewed as a contract between families, a tool for strengthening alliances, and a way to ensure stability within the strict hierarchy of society. If you were a girl born into a samurai household in the 13th or 14th century, your future was mapped out long before you ever reached adolescence. The moment you drew breath, your value was calculated, not by your personality or dreams, but by your potential usefulness in marrying into another family. Your childhood was essentially a countdown to the day you would be handed over like a package sealed with family crests. The age of marriage shocks most modern ears. Girls were often married off as young as 12 or 13, sometimes even younger if families felt urgency in sealing a political alliance. Imagine barely being old enough to braid your own hair and already being considered ripe for marriage. Samurai clans, in particular, treated daughters as bargaining chips. A girl's wedding was not her celebration, but a chess move. Two clans might arrange her betrothal years before she reached puberty. There are cases recorded where a girl was promised in marriage before she was even born. If negotiations demanded it, she became a placeholder for future ties. This complete absence of choice was not questioned. A daughter had no voice in selecting a partner. Fathers and uncles sat across from clan representatives, sipping tea and calculating which union would yield the most power or land. When agreement was struck, the girl's life was effectively sold. Sometimes she would only learn of the arrangement days before the ceremony, summoned into her mother's room to be told in solemn tones to pack her belongings and prepare to become a wife. You can picture the weight of that moment, the tightness in her chest, the mixture of fear and resignation, as she realizes that childhood has ended not because she chose it to, but because others decided her usefulness demanded it. The ceremonies themselves were steeped in ritual, but even these highlighted her lack of agency. Weddings involved processions of dowries, elaborate clothing, and religious blessings, but through it all, the bride was expected to remain passive. Her silence symbolized obedience, her lowered gaze symbolized humility. From the first step into her husband's home, she was already expected to perform the role of dutiful shadow. There was no question of compatibility, affection, or personal aspiration. The only question was, would she fulfill her role without embarrassing either family? Of course, this arrangement wasn't confined to the samurai class. Wealthy peasants and merchants also practiced early, arranged marriages, though the motivations leaned more towards securing labour, land, or trading partners. In many villages, a girl of 12 might suddenly be married to a man 10 or 15 years her senior, someone she had barely spoken to before. She was valued not for companionship, but for her ability to bear children, manage household duties, and reflect positively on her in-laws. The speed and efficiency of these unions turned women into transferable assets, tools of stability rather than people within our lives. Once in her new household, the young wife's responsibilities began immediately. Childbearing was considered her foremost duty. The expectation was that she would produce heirs quickly, ideally sons to carry on the family line. If she failed to conceive soon after marriage, whispers might start among in-laws, her status questioned, her usefulness doubted. The pressure was relentless, especially for adolescent brides who often lacked the physical maturity for safe childbirth. Many young wives found themselves pregnant before their bodies were fully ready, leading to high rates of maternal mortality. Death in childbirth was common, and if you were unlucky enough to die before producing a son, your entire life would be judged as wasted. Failure to please a husband or his family didn't always end with whispered disapproval. Divorce loomed as an ever-present threat. Men had near-total authority to discard their wives if they were dissatisfied for any reason. Illness, infertility, disobedience, or simply displeasure. A mikudari-han, or letter of divorce, was all it took. The wife had no legal power to contest it. One piece of paper, and she was cast out. Divorce, for a woman, carried not just personal loss but deep disgrace. Returning to her natal home wasn't always possible. Parents often rejected daughters who came back divorced, seeing them as failures that brought dishonour to the family name. Even if her family took her back, she lived with the stigma of rejection stamped onto her identity. In some cases, divorced women became wanderers, forced into servitude or prostitution to survive. Imagine the constant fear gnawing at you, that one wrong word, one failed pregnancy, or one perceived act of defiance could end not only your marriage, but your very place in society. For upper-class women, this risk was heightened by politics. A daimyo might marry a daughter of another powerful clan, not for love, but for alliance. If that alliance failed, or if political winds shifted, she could be repudiated, sent away like a returned parcel. Her fate was collateral damage in the chessboard of feudal politics. Even worse, she might be ordered to remain married in name while living in isolation, her husband discarding her emotionally but keeping her legally bound to prevent scandal. The emotional toll of these unions is easy to imagine. A girl barely in her teens, removed from her familiar home, thrust into a household of strangers where every move is judged, every mistake magnified. She would be under the watchful eye of her new mother-in-law, who often became the most demanding figure in her life. In-laws could be harsher than husbands, expecting perfection in household tasks and obedience in demeanour. For a wife, failure to fold clothes properly or to serve tea at the right temperature might trigger scolding or corporal punishment. Domestic violence was not taboo, it was normalised. Manuals instructed husbands on how to discipline wives, and women were told to accept such correction as rightful. If beaten, a woman was expected to reflect on her mistakes, not question her husband's authority. Early marriage thus chained girls to lifetimes of potential abuse with no legal recourse and no escape route. Another unsettling dimension was the symbolic erasure of identity. Upon marriage, a woman often adopted her husband's family name and completely subsumed her individuality into his lineage. She became not herself but an extension of her husband's household. This was so rigid that even in religious records women were often listed simply as wife of or mother of, their own names erased from history. It is telling that many of the women whose stories survive are remembered not by what they did but by whom they belonged to. There was, too, the constant reality of hierarchy among wives. A daimyo might have an official wife and multiple concubines, each ranked in importance. The official wife was valued for political pedigree, concubines for producing heirs, but none of these roles granted real security. If you failed to meet expectations, you could be cast aside. Marriages, whether of peasants or lords, were contracts with performance clauses that only women could fail. Even outside elite society, peasant marriages held their own suffocating expectations. A farmer's wife was not only expected to bear children, but to labour alongside her husband in the fields, haul water, gather firewood, spin textiles, and tend livestock. Her marriage contract meant a lifetime of toil, with little rest and less recognition. If her husband grew tired of her or suspected infidelity, he could still issue a divorce letter. Again, the burden of survival fell entirely on her shoulders. When you think about it, marriage in feudal Japan was a paradoxical cage. It was considered a woman's ultimate duty, her only path to stability. Yet the very institution that promised her protection often delivered the opposite: exposure to danger, humiliation, and abandonment. A husband's whims decided whether she lived with dignity or in disgrace. Perhaps the cruelest irony was that girls were raised to anticipate this fate. From the time they could hold chopsticks, they were reminded that their destiny was to marry and serve. Lessons in etiquette, household management, and obedience were not for personal development, but for ensuring that when the marriage contract arrived, they could step seamlessly into their assigned role. The training of daughters was little more than grooming them for submission. By the time you reached your wedding day, you were no longer a person, but an asset exchange between men, a silent player in a deal you never signed, and once you crossed the threshold of your husband's home, every day became a test. Would you meet expectations, bear sons, and obey without question? Or would you slip, inviting divorce, disgrace, and the collapse of your fragile place in society? That was marriage in feudal Japan. A duty without love, a gamble without fairness, a lifetime without choice. And for women, it was often just the beginning of suffering. Childbearing in feudal Japan was not just expected of women, it was demanded, measured, and judged as their ultimate worth. From the day you married, your life became a countdown to pregnancy, and every month without conception brought whispers, scrutiny, and doubt. A woman's body was seen not as her own, but as a vessel for heirs, a walking cradle whose only true accomplishment was producing sons to extend the family line. Whether you were the daughter of a peasant or the wife of a daimyo, the weight of reproduction pressed down on you with relentless force. Imagine yourself as a young bride, perhaps only 13 or 14, already shuffled into marriage by clan politics or family arrangements. You barely know your husband, and your body is still adjusting from childhood, yet almost immediately the household begins watching you for signs of pregnancy. Did your appetite change? Did you feel faint in the mornings? Did your cycle skip? A chorus of in-laws, servants, or neighbours would speculate, because your womb wasn't just your concern, it was the family's business, their legacy, their prestige. The physical toll was brutal. In an age without modern medicine, pregnancies carried immense risks. Hemorrhage, infection, malnutrition, unobstructed labour were common killers. Midwives had knowledge passed down through generations, but tools were crude, and superstitions often guided care more than science. For example, some families believed that tying protective charms to the bedframe or chanting sutras over the mother would ward off complications. Helpful, perhaps for peace of mind, but not much when a mother's pelvis was too small or the baby was breech. Many women died in childbirth, their last cries echoing through paper-thin walls, while husbands already thought ahead to remarriage for the sake of producing an heir. And the newborns? Their survival was equally uncertain. Infant mortality was staggeringly high, especially among the lower classes. Fevers, infections, malnutrition, and lack of medical knowledge meant many babies died before their first birthday. A woman could endure multiple pregnancies, each one leaving her weaker yet stillberry child after child. Imagine the despair, holding a baby swaddled in cotton, listening to its laboured breaths, praying to the household shrine for mercy, only to dig a grave by the next sunrise. And still, the expectation remained, try again, and this time produce a healthy son. For upper-class women, the pressure was even more suffocating. A daimyo's wife was expected to bear heirs who could inherit land and titles. If she failed to produce a male child, her position in the household weakened. Concubines were often introduced, and if one of them bore a son, the official wife might be pushed into the background, humiliated in her own home. Imagine being dressed in silks, surrounded by retainers, yet living in constant fear that another woman could replace you with a single birth. Superstitions shaped much of the experience. Pregnant women were advised to avoid certain foods, like squid, because it was thought the child's limbs might become twisted. If you ate rabbit meat, people warned, your baby might develop a cleft lip resembling the hare's split mouth. Some families forced women to stay indoors for long stretches, believing exposure to storms or eclipses could harm the unborn child. While some of these practices offered rest, many left women isolated, frightened, and weighed down by responsibility for forces beyond their control. Labour itself was often endured with little pain relief beyond herbal teas or pressure points. Imagine lying on tatami mats, clutching a rope suspended from the ceiling while waves of pain tore through you. The room filled with the smell of sweat, blood, and incense, midwives urging you to push, family members murmuring sutras outside. If complications arose, there was little recourse. A breech birth or prolonged labour could drag on for days, leaving both mother and child dead. In some accounts, women were urged to bite down on a wooden stick to muffle screams, lest their cries be seen as weakness or bring shame. Surviving childbirth didn't guarantee peace. Postpartum complications, fevers, infections, hemorrhages could strike days later. Without antibiotics, even small wounds became deadly. Mothers sometimes lingered in agony, drifting in and out of consciousness while relatives debated how soon the husband should remarry. Your life, after all, was replaceable. Your womb was what mattered. The toll didn't stop with birth. Nursing an infant placed further strain on already weakened bodies. Malnourished women struggled to produce milk, forcing families to use substitutes like rice gruel, which lacked vital nutrients. Babies wasted away, their cries fading until silence fell in the household. Each loss hardened expectations on the mother. Bear another. Try again. Fulfill your duty. The psychological burden was immense. Every miscarriage, every stillbirth, every infant death was interpreted not as a tragedy of circumstance, but often as a failure of the mother. Superstition blamed women for bad karma, impurity, or improper behaviour during pregnancy. Did she fail to pray at the right shrine? Did she step over a threshold improperly? Did she anger the household spirits? The blame fell squarely on her shoulders, regardless of reality. A woman grieving her dead child was expected to bow her head and apologise as though her sorrow were an inconvenience to the family. Widows faced another cruel twist of expectation. If their husbands died, whether by illness, accident, or ritual seppuku, women were often pressured to show loyalty by following their husbands in death. For some, this meant performing jigai, the female counterpart to seppuku, by cutting the throat with a dagger. Others entered convents, their lives effectively ended as they disappeared into isolation. Even if not literally sacrificed, a widow's worth was judged by how fully she extinguished her own desires after her husband's death. Bearing children was the duty of a wife. Ceasing to exist was often the duty of a widow. Among peasants, childbearing was even more entangled with survival. A farmer's wife had to give birth, recover quickly, and return to the fields almost immediately. No extended rest period, no hired nursemaids, just swaddling the baby to her chest and trudging back into muddy paddies. Malnutrition, exhaustion, and harsh conditions led to endless cycles of miscarriages, stillbirths, and maternal deaths. Some villages even practiced female infanticide during famines, reasoning that boys could labour in the fields and carry on the family line, while girls were seen as future burdens requiring dowries. It was a horrifying calculation, but one rooted in the brutal economics of survival. Within cities, courtesans and women in pleasure quarters faced a particularly cruel reality. Pregnancies in brothels were unwanted, threatening both the business and the fragile health of the women. Owners forced abortions through herbal concoctions, dangerous procedures, or outright infanticide. Many women were left infertile or permanently injured, their bodies wrecked by repeated cycles of coercion. For them, motherhood was not a blessing but a curse, denied by the same society that demanded their obedience. And yet, amid this suffering, women found ways to cope. Some prayed fervently to Kannon, the bodhisattva of mercy, believed to protect women in childbirth. Temples dedicated to Jizo, guardian of children, became places where grieving mothers left small statues dressed in red bibs, each representing a lost child. Walking through such temple grounds, you would see rows upon rows of these tiny effigies, silent testimony to the scale of loss. The sight was both haunting and strangely comforting. Women who had no voice in life at least carved one in stone for their children. Still, such spiritual solace could not erase the daily dangers. Every birth was a gamble, every pregnancy a tightrope walk between life and death. To be a woman in feudal Japan was to live under the constant shadow of reproductive duty, where your worth was calculated in sons produced and survival against impossible odds. Picture the life cycle. A girl married off in her early teens, pregnant by 14, perhaps a mother several times over by 20, her body worn thin by labour and toil. By 30, she might already look twice her age, her teeth blackened by cultural custom, her hands roughened by endless work, her spirit subdued by grief. If she lived long enough to see her children grown, it was often only because she'd survived a gauntlet of dangers that claimed so many others. That was the harsh reality of childbearing in feudal Japan, not the romanticised image of nurturing mothers beneath cherry blossoms, but a relentless cycle of pressure, pain, and peril. Women's bodies were battlegrounds, their lives gambled away in the pursuit of heirs and honour. And no matter how much suffering they endured, society rarely offered sympathy. To bear children was not just expected, it was demanded, as the one unyielding measure of a woman's worth. Step across the threshold of your new husband's home in feudal Japan, and you quickly discover that marriage didn't mean becoming a partner. It meant becoming a servant, not only to your husband but to his entire household. The mother-in-law especially loomed as the true master of your daily life. While husbands might be away serving lords, working fields, or attending to official duties, it was the older women of the household who enforced discipline, and for a new wife, their authority could be suffocating. Picture yourself at dawn in a modest samurai residence in the 17th century Edo. The sliding paper screens rattle slightly in the morning breeze, and you, barely a teenager, are already awake, tiptoeing across the tatami floors. Before the household stirs, you're expected to have swept the courtyard, hauled water from the well, lit the cooking fire and prepared rice. If the rice is too sticky, the tea too bitter, or the floors not swept to perfection, your mother-in-law will notice, and she won't simply scold, she will remind you that every imperfection reflects your unworthiness as a wife. Domestic servitude in feudal Japan wasn't just chores, it was a test of character. A wife's diligence was judged by how seamlessly she erased her own comfort. If your husband's parents enjoyed warm baths at night, you were expected to fetch, heat, and carry bucket after bucket until the tub was full, even if your back screamed with pain. If your in-laws preferred delicate fabrics, you scrubbed those garments by hand with cold water in the winter, your skin cracking from the icy sting. These weren't occasional tasks. They were relentless cycles of labour that defined every waking hour. Among peasants, the labour multiplied. A farmer's wife didn't just cook and clean. She joined the men in planting rice seedlings, pulling weeds, and harvesting in back-breaking crouches for hours on end. Then she returned home to spin thread, weave cloth, and prepare food. In-laws often criticised her relentlessly. Was her weaving tight enough? Did she drop a single grain of rice while serving? Did she bow low enough when handing a dish to her husband's father? For mistakes, punishments were swift. Sometimes verbal abuse, sometimes blows, sometimes days of forced silence and isolation. The mother-in-law's power in particular carried a sharp edge. She had endured the same hardships in her youth and now wielded them like weapons. Many older women enforced servitude harshly, believing it was their right to break new wives into obedience. Imagine living under the gaze of a woman who could command you to redo a task 10 times, not because it was necessary, but because she wanted to remind you of your place. In some households, wives were forbidden to eat until their in-laws finished, waiting hungrily in the shadows for scraps. For samurai households, the demands took on a political tone. A samurai's wife not only managed domestic duties but also had to maintain the household's reputation. Guests were entertained with precision, and the wife was judged on her ability to serve tea with elegance, arrange flowers in perfect balance, and ensure the home reflected honour. Behind the beauty of these rituals lay the endless drilling of etiquette, rehearsed to the point where any slip, a misplaced bow, a trembling hand, could be deemed a disgrace to the entire family. A husband's reputation might falter because his wife did not serve tea with enough serenity. The hierarchy extended to children as well. As a wife, you were expected to care for your own children, but also often for nieces, nephews, or siblings of your husband. You might nurse more than one infant at a time, regardless of your health. If your milk dried up from exhaustion or malnutrition, blame still landed on you. And heaven forbid you show preference for your own children over those of your in-laws. Favoritism could spark outrage. The relentless labour was made heavier by constant surveillance. In villages, neighbours gossiped endlessly, ready to report a woman's shortcomings to her in-laws. If you were seen resting too long in the sun after fieldwork, it became a story of laziness. If your laughter carried too loudly at the well, it became a tale of disrespect. A woman's reputation was policed not only within the home but throughout the community, where every pair of eyes reinforced the cage, and there was little room for error. A sick woman could expect no reprieve. Fever or fatigue did not excuse chores. If you failed to meet expectations, you risked punishment or even divorce. A husband could issue the dreaded mikudarehan, a letter of divorce, on grounds as vague as laziness or disobedience. That meant being sent back to your parents' house in disgrace, likely rejected by your natal family for failing your marital duty. So even in illness, women dragged themselves through chores, coughing, shivering and stumbling, terrified that one day of weakness could cost them everything. Corporal punishment within the household was normalized. If a wife failed to serve properly, husbands or in-laws might strike her with bamboo rods, wooden spoons, or even fists. Locking women in dark storage rooms without food or water for days was another common punishment. Outside interference was rare because the household was considered the man's fortress. Neighbours who heard screams might shake their heads, but they would not intervene. Law codes offered no recourse because discipline of wives was considered a private matter. The burden extended beyond physical labour to emotional suppression. Wives were expected to smile politely at guests even when exhausted, to show gratitude for correction even when beaten, and to lower their eyes even when insulted. Expressing anger, resentment, or grief was labelled rebellion. Imagine carrying the silent grief of miscarriages, the despair of poverty, the humiliation of scolding, and never being allowed to show more than a placid face. It wasn't just the body enslaved, it was the spirit. Among wealthier households, servitude took different forms but with no less cruelty. Elite women might not harvest rice. but they managed sprawling households with dozens of servants. That meant constant oversight, endless responsibility, and accountability for every mistake a servant made. If a guest's kimono was stained, it reflected on the mistress. If a garden was not raked perfectly, blame fell on her. The pressure was immense, and failure could still invite harsh rebuke or even removal from her position as wife. And remember, divorce was always a sword hanging overhead. Unlike men, women could not initiate divorce. They had no legal grounds to escape abusive households. The best they could hope for was retreat into a convent, but even that required family approval. Most endured quietly because the alternative was destitution. A divorced or runaway wife carried the brand of dishonour, making survival nearly impossible. Even when women bore sons and fulfilled their primary duty, servitude never ended. In-laws still scrutinised their behaviour, still demanded endless labour. A mother-in-law might remind her daughter-in-law daily that her place in the household was secured not by love but by duty. Some women spent their entire lives under the shadow of older in-laws, serving until they themselves aged into the role of disciplinarian. For many, the only escape was death. Think about the irony. Feudal Japanese culture celebrated loyalty, honour and discipline among men, yet it demanded even greater loyalty and discipline from women without granting them honour in return. Samurai fought battles for glory, women fought battles against exhaustion, humiliation and invisibility. One group's sacrifices were immortalised in ballads and scrolls, the others were erased in silence, and yet women endured. They carried water until their shoulders bent permanently, scrubbed floors until their hands cracked, bowed until their spines curved. They endured scolding, gossip and violence, not because they lacked spirit but because society offered no escape. The domestic world, with all its rituals and routines, was as much a battlefield as any samurai's field of war. And for women there was no armour, only endurance. So when you picture feudal Japan, don't just imagine cherry blossoms and samurai swords. Imagine the dim kitchens where smoke stung women's eyes, the rice paddies where mud clung to their ankles, the storerooms where they sat shivering in punishment. Behind every polished tea ceremony was a woman who had been drilled, scolded, and exhausted into perfect performance. Behind every honour-bound samurai was a wife crushed under expectations. Domestic servitude wasn't an accident of the system, it was the system, the unseen foundation on which feudal Japan balanced. Property in feudal Japan was never neutral ground. It was land, rice, coin, and power, everything that structured society, and within this rigid system, women were almost entirely cut off from ownership. From the highest noble households down to the smallest farming plots, inheritance and wealth were overwhelmingly funneled through men. For women, the denial of property rights was more than just exclusion from wealth, it was exclusion from autonomy itself. If you couldn't hold land, you couldn't shape your destiny. You couldn't decide where to live, how to survive, or how to provide for your children. You belonged, like the home and the fields, to someone else. To understand the severity of this, think of how land functioned in feudal Japan. Rice wasn't just food, it was currency. Domains were measured in koku, the amount of rice that could feed one man for a year. Daimyo, samurai and peasants all lived by this measure. Whoever controlled rice paddies controlled wealth, and whoever controlled wealth controlled loyalty. Men passed this rice economy from father to son, lord to vassal, leaving women perpetually outside the chain of inheritance. Even when women helped labour in the fields, hauling water and planting seedlings, the fruits of that labour were registered not in their names, but in the names of their husbands, fathers, or sons. In theory, there were exceptions. Some ancient Japanese customs, especially before the rigid Tokugawa order, allowed women to inherit property in the absence of male heirs. Noble women in the Heian period, for example, sometimes held estates in their own names. But by the Kamakura and Muromachi eras, Confucian ideals began tightening around society like steel bands. By the Tokugawa period, those exceptions had narrowed to slivers. A daughter might inherit temporarily but only until she married, at which point control shifted to her husband. Even widows who retained some rights often had guardians appointed over them. In practice, autonomy evaporated. This dependency left women exposed to constant vulnerability. Imagine being a widow in a small farming village, your husband dead from illness or conscription. the land you had worked alongside him suddenly became the concern of your brothers-in-law. Without male protection, officials might reassign your plot to another family. Tax collectors didn't pause to consider your plight. Rice levies still had to be paid. Many widows found themselves forced to remarry quickly, not for love, but simply to secure a man's name under which property could remain. Your entire survival hinged not on your skill or labour, but on whether another man would claim you. For samurai women, the stakes could be even higher. The Bukusho, the code of the warrior class, underscored family honour and male authority. Samurai wives had no claim to their husband's stipend or lands. If a samurai died without a son, the property reverted to the clan or lord, not to the wife. This left widows scrambling. Some were sent back to natal families, others were ordered into convents. Their lives effectively ended in exile. To lose a husband was to lose income, land, and standing all at once. Survival became a matter of begging male relatives for mercy. Merchants' wives fared little better. Though merchants accumulated wealth in cities like Osaka and Edo, wives had limited say in its management. They often handled day-to-day bookkeeping, but ultimate authority rested with husbands or sons. If a husband squandered wealth, the wife bore the consequences without any right to intervene. She might labour to rebuild the household by spinning cloth or running a small stall, but legally the business name remained in male hands. This denial of property created ripple effects across generations. Daughters were seen as liabilities because they required dowries, draining family resources without offering land or wealth in return. Sons inherited fields, businesses, or stipends, while daughters were traded in marriage deals. The cycle reinforced itself. Because women couldn't own, they were devalued. Because they were devalued, they were married off early. Because they were married off, they lost any tenuous grip on property. Even in urban centres, where women sometimes ran inns, bathhouses, or small shops, the law treated them as exceptions, tolerated but precarious. If a husband or male relative appeared, ownership rights defaulted to him. Women could keep businesses alive only if society deemed them necessary, often after widowhood. And even then, neighbours and officials treated them with suspicion, as though a woman daring to handle money or property had crossed into forbidden territory. For lower-class women, the injustice was even starker. A peasant's wife worked the same muddy fields as her husband, bent double under the sun, her hands caked with dirt. Yet when harvest time came, taxes were levied in his name, and any surplus was credited to him. If her husband mistreated her or abandoned her, she had no land to fall back on, no legal foothold to claim even the paddies she herself had tended. Divorce meant not only social disgrace but complete destitution. A man could discard his wife with a simple letter, but she could not claim a single grain of rice in return. Religion reinforced these restrictions. Buddhist doctrines often warned that women were too spiritually tainted to manage property responsibly. Confucian texts declared that women's role was obedience, not authority. Even legal documents, when they mentioned women at all, framed them as dependents, first of fathers, then husbands, then sons. The entire ideological framework worked to convince women that property was not theirs to touch. The cultural messaging was relentless. Instructional texts like Honor Daigaku reminded wives that their virtue lay in humility and service, not ambition or ownership. Girls grew up knowing that no matter how hard they worked, they would never hold land in their own right. Their education, when it existed, emphasized sewing, cooking, and etiquette, skills meant to prepare them for households they would never control. Property rights were never on the syllabus. Consider, too, the cruel double standard. Men could gamble away land, squander inheritances, or lose stipends in mismanagement, and society might forgive them as reckless but redeemable. Women, denied the right to own at all, were accused of weakness and incompetence as justification for the very laws that excluded them. It was a circular trap, barred from ownership because they lacked ability, then accused of lacking ability because they were barred from ownership. This systemic exclusion bred constant insecurity. A woman's roof over her head was never guaranteed by her own labour, only by her attachment to men. If she bore sons, she might secure a fragile thread of stability. Her son could one day inherit and perhaps protect her. But until then, she lived under the threat of removal, abandonment, or poverty. Every meal she ate, every tatami mat she slept on, was contingent on male authority. For many, the only slight reprieve came in old age, when mothers-in-law gained dominance over new brides. Having survived decades of servitude, some older women wielded authority fiercely, becoming the enforcers of the same system that once crushed them. Their power, however, was domestic, not legal. They could scold, punish, or command daughters-in-law, but they still couldn't sign property deeds or control estates. Even in age, their authority was a shadow of what men held from birth. If you step back, the injustice becomes clear. Women's labour sustained the system, but they were erased from its rewards. They planted rice they couldn't claim, wove cloth they couldn't sell, raised children who would inherit what they themselves were denied. Their entire existence propped up a structure that left them empty-handed. Property wasn't just about wealth. It was about agency, and in feudal Japan, that agency was systematically stripped from women, leaving them perpetually dependent, perpetually vulnerable. So when you picture the castles of daimyo, the estates of samurai, or the bustling shops of Edo merchants, remember the invisible scaffolding of women's labour holding it all up. They built, they sustained, they endured, but when it came to property, they were ghosts in their own homes, shadows with no claim to the soil beneath their feet. When you picture a samurai wife in feudal Japan, you might be tempted to imagine her as the serene lady of the house, arranging flowers or practicing calligraphy, while her husband prepared for battle. But beneath that surface image was a reality far harsher. Samurai wives were pawns, tools in the endless web of clan politics, bargaining chips in games of loyalty and survival. Their personal desires were irrelevant. Their marriages, movements, and even their very lives were dictated by strategy, not affection. Consider first how these marriages came about. A daimyo, seeking to strengthen alliances, would arrange for his son to marry the daughter of another powerful clan. The young woman might be barely in her teens, plucked from her family home and shipped off to a distant province, her fate sealed by men she barely knew. Her wedding was not her own milestone, but the signing of a political treaty. She was expected to bring honour, produce heirs, and, most importantly, serve as living proof of her father's loyalty to his allies. Samurai wives carried a burden heavier than simple household duties. They were hostages in all but name. During the Edo period, the Tokugawa shogunate enforced the Sankin-kotai system, which required daimyo to spend alternating years in Edo, modern Tokyo, and their home provinces. To ensure loyalty, the daimyo's wife and children were required to remain in Edo as honoured captives. Imagine that. Noble women, dressed in rich silks, living in beautiful mansions near Edo Castle, but unable to leave without permission. They were prisoners wrapped in luxury, their every move dictated by political necessity. Within the walls of a daimyo's residence, a wife's position was precarious. The official wife usually came from a prestigious clan, chosen not for love but for her father's power. Concubines filled the halls too, each ranked by importance, each vying for favour. The wife might technically outrank them, but her security was never guaranteed. If she failed to bear a male heir, her authority dwindled, and concubines who succeeded could eclipse her status. It was a constant competition, and the prize wasn't happiness, but mere survival. Think of the humiliation embedded in this system. A samurai husband could take concubines freely, often to strengthen alliances or display his wealth. Society praised this as shrewd strategy. A wife, by contrast, was bound to absolute fidelity. If she were even suspected of infidelity, punishment could be severe, sometimes execution. Her body was policed as though it were not hers, but a symbol of the clan's honour. Meanwhile, her husband's dalliances were celebrated as political manoeuvres. The double standard was suffocating. Even beyond issues of fidelity, wives were used as bargaining chips. In times of conflict, women were sometimes exchanged as hostages to guarantee treaties. A daimyo might send his daughter to live with a rival clan, not as a guest but as collateral. Her life was essentially a contract written in flesh. If her father betrayed the agreement, she could be executed. Imagine living with the knowledge that your very existence was a chess piece in someone else's war game. Wives also faced direct orders that denied them personal safety. If a castle came under siege, samurai men might expect their wives to commit suicide rather than be captured. The practice of jigai, ritual female suicide, involved cutting the throat while binding the legs together so the body would remain in a dignified position. This wasn't an act of personal choice but of duty. Wives were told it preserved family honour. Some women killed not only themselves but also their children to prevent capture. Their loyalty to the clan demanded that they erase themselves entirely rather than risk dishonor. Daily life in samurai households reflected this relentless pressure. A wife's mornings began with supervising servants, ensuring meals were prepared properly, and making sure the household reflected the prestige of the clan. Guests had to be entertained flawlessly. Ceremonies had to be performed without error. The pressure of etiquette was suffocating, because every slip could be interpreted as incompetence that shamed the entire family. Serving tea wasn't just pouring hot water over leaves, it was a test of composure under constant scrutiny. Even in rare moments of peace, women were constantly reminded of their fragility. Manuals such as the Honor Daigaku stressed humility, obedience, and silence. A samurai wife was urged to consider herself a shadow, never stepping ahead of her husband. Her loyalty wasn't to herself, not even to her children, but to the clan's reputation. Even when raising sons, she was expected to prepare them for the service of their lord, not for her own comfort in old age. The contradictions were endless. On one hand, wives were expected to be models of obedience and docility. On the other, they were sometimes required to manage entire households when husbands were away. That meant supervising retainers, keeping finances in order, and even defending castles if needed. Some women trained with the naginata, a long-bladed polearm, to protect their homes during sieges. Yet these moments of strength were always treated as exceptions, temporary performances until the men returned. Once peace resumed, wives were ushered back into silence, their authority erased. The emotional toll was staggering. Imagine being a young girl, taken from your family, placed in a castle filled with strangers, surrounded by concubines who eyed you with suspicion, under constant watch from retainers. You were expected to smile, bow, and perform endless rituals, even while knowing that your security depended entirely on producing a son. If you failed, you lived with the fear of disgrace or exile. If you succeeded, you still lived under the shadow of potential replacement, because your husband's alliances might demand another wife or concubine. There was no true sanctuary. Even religion offered little comfort. Temples reinforced obedience, preaching that women's loyalty was divine duty. Shrines might promise blessings for fertility, but they offered no relief from the constant surveillance of family and society. If a wife prayed too fervently for personal peace, she risked being accused of selfishness. For some women, the pressure became unbearable. Stories survive of samurai wives driven to despair, some committing suicide not for honor but out of exhaustion. Others withdrew into silence, their voices erased from history, leaving behind only names in genealogies or titles on memorial stones. And yet, their suffering was essential to the system. The stability of clans, the loyalty of daimyo, the prestige of samurai households, all rested on women's compliance. They were the glue binding alliances, the wombs producing heirs, the shadows maintaining household honor. Their erasure wasn't an accident. It was the foundation of feudal politics. When you imagine the grandeur of a daimyo's castle, high stone walls, watchtowers, and golden screens, remember that hidden within were women living as pawns, their movements dictated by treaties, their bodies controlled by codes of honor. Their suffering was unspeakable, not because it was secret, but because society refused to name its suffering at all. It was simply their duty. If marriage tied women's lives to politics, divorce revealed just how fragile and disposable those lives really were. In feudal Japan, a husband could decide at nearly any time that his wife no longer suited him, and he had the power to end the union with the stroke of a brush. A short document, the Mikudarihan, was all it took. 3 lines written on a piece of paper, "I divorce you," and a woman's world collapsed. There was no court to appeal to, no system of mediation, no chance for her to contest. The authority rested entirely with him. The reasons for divorce were shockingly vague. Illness could be grounds. Infertility or the failure to bear sons certainly justified dismissal. Disobedience was broad enough to cover nearly anything. A wife speaking out of turn, failing to prepare food correctly, or showing what her husband interpreted as disrespect. Laziness, jealousy, theft, even excessive gossip were all considered legitimate reasons. A husband didn't need to prove them. His word alone was enough. Imagine the terror of living under such a system. Every mistake, every perceived flaw, every misunderstanding carried the weight of potential exile. You lived with a constant awareness that your position was conditional. If your husband grew bored, if another woman caught his eye, if your body failed to give him heirs, he could discard you as easily as replacing a broken utensil. The uncertainty gnawed at women constantly. Security was an illusion. Obedience was a survival strategy. Once divorced, the consequences were catastrophic. In theory, a woman could return to her natal home. In practice, many families refused to take daughters back. Divorce was seen as shameful, a mark of failure. Parents who accepted a divorced daughter might face scorn from neighbours and risk damaging prospects for their other children. Siblings resented the burden of supporting her. In many cases, the door home was closed. So what then? Without property rights, without legal standing, without independent wealth, a divorced woman had few options. Some entered convents, retreating into religious life. For others, the path led into prostitution or servitude, forced to sell their bodies or labour to survive. Divorce didn't just strip women of status, it stripped them of safety, reducing them to outcasts in a society that already devalued them. The stigma was suffocating. A divorced woman was whispered about in markets and villages. People assumed she must have been disobedient, infertile, or unworthy. Suitors avoided her. Remarriage was rare and usually undesirable, often to older widowers or poor men looking for cheap labour. Even if she remarried, the shadow of her past followed her, a constant reminder that she had failed once before. Imagine the humiliation of being forced to bow politely to neighbours who gossiped about why your husband rejected you. There was also a cruel imbalance in how divorce functioned. Men could issue a mikudarihan with ease, but women had no equivalent right. If a wife suffered beatings, neglect, or humiliation, she could not leave legally. At best, she could appeal to her natal family to intervene, but fathers and brothers rarely risked dishonouring themselves by confronting a son-in-law. Often, they told her to endure. A woman could be trapped in violence indefinitely, because society insisted her duty outweighed her suffering. Even widows faced their own kind of dismissal. If a woman's husband died, she did not inherit property or authority. Instead, she was often pressured to remarry quickly, sometimes against her will. Families treated widows as unsettled accounts to be managed, shifting them into new marriages to preserve alliances or reduce financial burdens. A widow who resisted risked being sent to a convent, her autonomy erased either way. And if you think elite women were spared, think again. The wife of a daimyo could be set aside if politics demanded it. If her clan fell out of favour, she might be sent back in disgrace, her children left behind. Concubines lived with even less stability. If they lost their lord's favour, they could be dismissed overnight, shipped back to families or convents with nothing but the clothes on their backs. Their worth evaporated the moment their usefulness ended. Divorce also revealed the double standard of fidelity. Men could keep concubines, visit pleasure quarters, and take lovers without consequence. Wives, meanwhile, faced suspicion at every turn. A mere rumour of infidelity could justify dismissal or even execution. Imagine living under constant watch, knowing that your husband's wandering was excused while your slightest misstep could destroy you. Even friendly conversation with another man might be twisted into accusation. Divorce wasn't just about failure, it was about control, a constant reminder that your life balanced on his whim. This imbalance fed into the larger structure of control in society. Women's lives were kept deliberately unstable so they would never forget dependence. The threat of divorce loomed like a blade, keeping wives obedient, deferential, and cautious. Husbands wielded it not only as punishment but as discipline, reminding wives that their presence in the home was conditional, and yet, despite all this, women adapted. Some cultivated skills to make themselves indispensable, skilled weaving, bookkeeping, or management of servants. By proving their usefulness, they lessened the risk of dismissal. Others tried to bear multiple children quickly, hoping that sons would anchor their position. But even these strategies offered no guarantees. A famine, a failed crop, a shift in political alliances, all could unravel security overnight. The cruelty of the system was that divorce rarely punished men. A man who divorced one wife simply remarried, often to someone younger or more politically advantageous. His reputation might even rise if the new marriage brought better alliances. For women, divorce was a death sentence to social standing. For men, it was a tactical maneuver. The imbalance could not have been clearer. In the end, divorce in feudal Japan wasn't about justice, fairness, or even compatibility. It was about power. Men held it, women lost it, men used it, women suffered from it. The Mikudarihan may have been only 3 lines long, but its shadow stretched across entire lives, turning wives into perpetual hostages in their own homes. So when you imagine women in feudal Japan walking softly through dimly lit corridors, bowing deeply to husbands and in-laws, remember the silent terror behind their lowered eyes. At any moment a husband could dip a brush into ink, write a few words, and unravel their existence. Their marriages weren't bonds of love, they were contracts with escape clauses that only one side could use. And that imbalance kept women locked in obedience, fearful of a paper that could erase them as easily as if they had never been wives at all. Step into the narrow, lantern-lit streets of Edo in the 17th century, and you'll find an entire district devoted to pleasure, a walled city within a city known as Yoshiwara. Its gates were not open to all, only men with the means to pay could enter. Inside, the air smelled of incense, sake, and sweat. Paper lanterns cast red and gold light across wooden facades, and behind sliding doors sat rows of women, dressed in silks painted in layers of white powder, rouge, and ink-blackened teeth. From a distance, it looked like a world of elegance. But if you listened more closely, beneath the music of shamisen and the chatter of drunken clients, you could hear something else. The quiet sighs of women trapped in lives they never chose. For many of these women, entry into Yoshiwara was not voluntary. Families, especially poor ones, often sold their daughters into prostitution to pay off debts or to survive famine. Contracts might last 10 years or longer, though few women lived to see freedom. A girl of 10 or 12 might be handed over to a brothel owner, her parents clutching a few coins in exchange. From that moment she ceased to be a daughter and became property. Her labour, her body, even her survival belonged to someone else. The system was brutally organised. Women were ranked from the elite courtesans, known as oiran, down to the lowest class attendants. The oiran lived in relative luxury, entertaining high-ranking samurai and wealthy merchants trained in music, dance, and witty conversation. But even they were still captives. Beneath them, the vast majority of women endured far harsher lives. They were little more than servants, waiting in dark, crowded rooms for clients who cared nothing for them. Disease spread rapidly, and deaths were frequent. A brothel owner might replace a dead girl within weeks, as if swapping out a broken tool. Daily life was suffocating. Girls were locked inside brothels, unable to leave without permission. Guards patrolled the gates to prevent escape. Windows were barred, doors locked, and attempts to flee were punished severely. Some runaways had their heads shaved as public humiliation before being dragged back. Others were beaten or starved until they submitted. Escape was nearly impossible, because society itself colluded to keep them inside. A runaway courtesan who made it back to her village would often be rejected by her family, branded as defiled and unworthy. The stigma was one of the cruelest parts of this system. A woman sold into Yoshiwara bore not only physical suffering but social death. Even if she survived her contract, she could rarely return to normal life. Families often refused to accept her back. Prospective husbands shunned her, fearing dishonour. Merchants denied her service. The very society that profited from her suffering treated her as contaminated once she was no longer profitable. Health conditions inside the quarters were dire. Venereal diseases spread unchecked, and treatments were primitive at best. Some women turned to dangerous herbal remedies, often worsening their conditions. Others endured untreated infections until their bodies gave out. Tuberculosis, malnutrition, and constant exhaustion claimed many lives long before their contracts expired. The sight of sick, coughing women sitting in dim corners was as much a part of Yoshiwara as the painted faces in the windows. For those forced into pregnancies, the situation grew even darker. Brothel owners had no interest in raising children. Abortions were forced through crude methods, herbal concoctions that caused violent bleeding, physical trauma or infanticide if the child was born alive. Many women were left permanently scarred, infertile or dead from the procedures. The suffering was hidden behind curtains, but its echoes were everywhere, in whispered stories, in sudden disappearances, in graves marked only by wooden stakes outside city walls. Yet even in this environment, women were trained to present an illusion. The oiran were schooled in elegance, expected to recite poetry, play shamisen, and master the art of conversation. Their beauty and wit were tools to attract wealthy clients, but beneath the painted smiles lay exhaustion and despair. Each performance chipped away at their sense of self, until many no longer knew where the mask ended and the person began. Lower-ranked women had no such illusions. They were treated as bodies to be used quickly and discarded. Outside of Yoshiwara, unlicensed prostitution thrived in smaller towns and along highways. These women had even fewer protections. They worked in makeshift inns or roadside stalls, exposed to violence from clients and exploitation by handlers. While Yoshiwara at least had some structure, however cruel, these women lived entirely on the margins, vulnerable to assault, disease and starvation. Society condemned them, yet relied on them. It was a cycle of demand and punishment, exploitation and rejection. The irony was striking. Men of every class, from merchants to samurai to nobles, frequented pleasure quarters openly, sometimes boasting of their visits. Their reputations remained untarnished. Women, on the other hand, bore lifelong stigma for being forced into the system. The double standard couldn't have been sharper. One side enjoyed, the other suffered. One side paid, the other paid with their lives. For geisha, often mistaken as part of this world, the line was thin. While technically entertainers trained in arts rather than prostitutes, many geisha faced pressure from patrons to provide sexual services. Families desperate for money apprenticed their daughters into okiya, geisha houses, where they endured years of discipline, training and control. Even if they rose to fame, they were bound by contracts, financially indebted to their houses and subject to the demands of wealthy men. For those who failed to succeed, the fallback was often the brothel, a pipeline from art to exploitation. Society painted pleasure quarters as glamorous, even necessary. Art, literature and theatre depicted courtesans as icons of beauty. Yoshiwara was called a floating world, a place of dreams. But the women trapped inside knew the truth. It was a world of cages, where their lives were consumed for entertainment and discarded when they were no longer profitable. The illusion of elegance was a mask hiding generations of unspeakable suffering. For a woman in feudal Japan, being sold into prostitution wasn't just bad luck. It was a fate that devoured body, mind, and spirit. Few survived long enough to buy freedom, and those who did found that freedom was hollow. They stepped outside the gates only to face a society that saw them as tainted forever. Some tried to run small shops or live quietly, but whispers followed them. Others ended up right back where they started, trapped again by poverty or coercion. So when you picture the glowing lanterns of Yoshiwara, remember the shadows they cast. Behind every elegant oiran on parade were dozens of women coughing in dark rooms, grieving lost children, or silently enduring nights they could not escape. The pleasure quarters weren't places of romance. They were prisons of painted misery, where women's suffering became the backdrop for men's indulgence. Concubinage in feudal Japan was not simply a matter of private indulgence. It was an institution woven directly into the political and social fabric of society. To be a concubine was to live a life perched precariously between privilege and peril, where your body, your children, and your future were dictated by the shifting tides of your lord's favour. On paper, concubines might be listed in genealogies, their children sometimes elevated to positions of influence. In practice, most lived in an atmosphere of jealousy, humiliation, and constant uncertainty. At the highest levels, concubines played a key role in clan strategy. Daimyo maintained official wives, chosen from powerful families to seal alliances, but those wives alone were rarely enough. Concubines multiplied the chances of producing male heirs and expanded political connections. A daimyo might take the daughter of a lesser samurai or merchant as a concubine to curry favour or to secure loyalty. Some were essentially hostages, their presence in a daimyo's household ensuring their father's obedience. For the women themselves, this meant their worth was reduced to their ability to bear sons, with no guarantee of long-term security. Inside a daimyo's residence, concubines were ranked, supervised, and controlled. The official wife sat at the top, but concubines were carefully monitored for signs of pregnancy, obedience, and decorum. Rivalries thrived. A woman who bore a son could rise dramatically in influence, overshadowing even the official wife, but if she failed, she could sink into obscurity, her existence tolerated but her value minimal. Imagine the constant tension of this environment. Every glance from servants, Every smile from retainers, every rumour of the lord's shifting attention carried life-altering implications. Jealousy was not simply personal, it was institutional. Wives and concubines were often pitted against one another, their competition serving the interests of men who controlled them. A wife who resented a concubine could demand her dismissal. A concubine who gained influence could erode the authority of the wife. In some households, intrigue grew so fierce that women were accused of sorcery, poisoning or treachery, sometimes leading to exile or execution. The walls of noble households were not just decorated with screens and calligraphy, they vibrated with whispers, plots, and fears, and yet concubinage was not confined to the elite. Samurai of lower ranks often took concubines, though on a smaller scale. These women were drawn from peasant or merchant families, and their status was far more precarious. A samurai might take a concubine while still married, expecting her to serve him without recognition or security. She had no official rights, no guarantees for her children, and no protection if cast aside. For many, concubinage meant a lifetime of servitude disguised as intimacy. At the imperial court, concubinage took on even more formalized dimensions. The emperor maintained multiple consorts and attendants, with ranks carefully delineated. Competition within the court was legendary. Women were selected for beauty, pedigree, or connections, and once inside the palace they lived in cloistered seclusion. Their movements were tightly restricted, their conversations monitored, their ambitions curbed. If they failed to gain the emperor's attention, they could languish in obscurity for years, their youth and hopes wasted behind screens of brocade. For concubines of all ranks, the greatest asset and greatest danger was pregnancy. Bearing a son could transform a woman's fortunes overnight. She might rise in status, secure wealth for her child, and earn respect in the household. But the reverse was equally true. A miscarriage, stillbirth, or the birth of a daughter could diminish her standing instantly. Worse, rival concubines and even the official wife might view her child as a threat. Infanticide, rumours of poisoning and mysterious illnesses often stalked the nurseries of noble households. A woman's joy at holding a newborn could quickly curdle into dread as she realised her child's survival threatened others' positions. The psychological toll was immense. Imagine being taken from your home at 14 or 15, thrust into a palace or daimyo's residence, and told that your future depended on pleasing a man you hardly knew. Your days revolved around grooming, etiquette, and endless waiting for summons. At night, you lay awake listening for footsteps, wondering if you would be called or ignored. Each call brought both hope and fear, hope for favour, fear of failure, and all the while you knew that if his interest waned, your life could collapse. Concubines were also symbols of power. A daimyo flaunted the number and beauty of his concubines as proof of his wealth and influence. The women became living trophies, paraded in silks, but denied freedom. Their very presence at banquets and ceremonies served as reminders of the lord's dominance. They were not companions so much as ornaments, displayed to impress rivals and reinforce hierarchies. Dismissal was always a looming threat. A concubine who fell out of favour might be sent back to her family, shamed and discarded. Others were exiled to convents, forced into lives of seclusion and prayer, cut off from the world. Some were simply abandoned, left without support, wandering on the margins of society. In each case, dismissal stripped them of identity and security. They had no property, no standing, and often no way to survive outside the household that once claimed them. Even those who seemed to succeed rarely found peace. The official wife, though ranked highest, lived in fear of being eclipsed by a concubine. A favoured concubine, though temporarily powerful, lived in fear of losing her lord's attention. Their lives were games of balance teetering on the edge of disgrace. Society admired their beauty, envied their silks, and whispered about their intrigues, but it ignored their suffering. The cruelty of the system was its pretense of honour. Men justified concubinage as necessary for alliances and heirs. Confucian ideals framed women's obedience as virtue, making resistance unthinkable. Religion offered no reprieve. Buddhist and Shinto teachings often reinforced women's subordination, casting their suffering as part of karmic duty. The structure ensured that women bore the costs of concubinage while men reaped the benefits. And yet, women within these systems sometimes found subtle ways to resist. Some cultivated influence through their children, guiding sons toward loyalty or ambition. Others wielded wit and intelligence, winning favour through conversation and strategy. A few left behind diaries or poetry that revealed their inner lives, voices otherwise silenced by history. These fragments remind us that behind every concubine's painted face was a person navigating impossible constraints. But the truth remains, concubinage in feudal Japan was a gilded cage. Its walls were decorated with silks and perfumes, but its bars were made of obedience and fear. Women who lived within it endured not just the whims of men, but the constant hostility of rivals, the crushing weight of expectation, and the ever-present risk of dismissal. Their lives were unspeakable not because no one saw them, but because society refused to call their suffering what it was. So when you imagine the grand households of daimyo and emperors, remember the unseen world behind sliding screens, the concubines waiting in silence, painting their faces by candlelight, whispering prayers for favour, and bracing themselves for a future that could vanish with a single shift of attention. Their beauty was celebrated, their obedience demanded, but their suffering was written out of the official record, leaving us only hints of the cages in which they lived. Religion in feudal Japan was not a refuge for women, it was another cage, gilded with ritual and cloaked in doctrine. Both Buddhism and Shinto, the two dominant systems of belief, reinforced women's subordination and helped justify their suffering as natural, karmic, or divinely ordained. To live as a woman in this world was to constantly hear that your body was defiled, your mind weak, and your only virtue obedience. The shrine, the temple, the sutra. These were not spaces of liberation, but echo chambers repeating the same command. Submit. Let's start with Buddhism. Imported centuries earlier from China and Korea, it had long since blended with Japanese customs by the feudal era. On the surface, Buddhism preached compassion and enlightenment for all beings, but in practice, its teachings about women were drenched in misogyny. A widely accepted doctrine insisted that women were incapable of achieving Buddhahood in their present form. They had to be reborn as men first. Their bodies were seen as inherently impure, polluted by menstruation, childbirth, and sexuality. This wasn't just abstract theology, it shaped daily attitudes. A woman entering a temple might be subtly reminded or openly told that her prayers were less effective than a man's, that her spiritual progress was inherently hindered. The Blood Pool Sutra is one stark example. It taught that women who died in childbirth would fall into a special hell, condemned to wallow in rivers of blood as punishment for the pollution their bodies produced. Imagine the cruelty of this belief in a society where women were expected to bear children constantly, at the risk of their own lives. Instead of compassion for their suffering, religion painted their deaths as karmic punishment. Families might sponsor costly rituals to save a deceased mother's soul, but the message was clear. Her suffering was her own fault, her impurity dragging her downward. Shinto, Japan's indigenous faith, was no gentler by the time of the Tokugawa shogunate. In its earliest forms, Shinto had revered female deities like Amaterasu, the sun goddess, and allowed women to serve as shamans or priestesses. But as Confucian values fused with Shinto practice, female authority eroded. By the feudal period, women were largely barred from positions of spiritual leadership. Shrines were run by male priests, and women's roles were reduced to assistants, dancers, or ceremonial performers. Even entering sacred spaces was sometimes restricted. Certain mountains, for instance, barred women entirely, declaring them too impure to tread holy ground. Mount Amin still carries that prohibition today, a remnant of centuries of exclusion. Religious codes even dictated women's daily behaviour. During menstruation, women were often banned from shrines or temples, their natural cycles framed as pollution. Childbirth, too, was treated as defilement. New mothers were considered ritually unclean for weeks, and sometimes barred from participating in household or religious ceremonies. These exclusions didn't just stigmatize women, they reinforced the idea that their bodies were inherently dangerous, contaminating the purity of family and community. Education within religious contexts also reinforced subordination. Texts like Honor Daigaku, though secular in function, were deeply influenced by Confucian and Buddhist moral codes. They instructed women to bow, obey, and accept correction as divine duty. Temples sometimes provided basic literacy for upper-class girls, teaching them to read sutras or compose polite poetry, but the purpose was never to expand their horizons. It was to make them more effective ornaments in marriage, able to recite prayers or host religious ceremonies with grace. Independent thought, spiritual or otherwise, was discouraged. For some women, convents seemed like an escape. A nun's life promised freedom from marriage and childbearing, a chance to live apart from the relentless demands of in-laws and husbands. Yet even here, autonomy was an illusion. Many women sent to convents had no choice. They were discarded wives, unwanted concubines, or political pawns removed from court intrigues. Their vows were less about spiritual calling and more about social exile. They lived in isolation, often in poverty, cut off from family and worldly life. Their existence was framed as pious, but beneath the surface it was punishment in disguise. Convents also reinforced the broader structures of control. Nuns were still subject to male oversight, often required to obey abbots or priests. Their spiritual worth was diminished by the same doctrines that tainted all women. While a monk could aspire to enlightenment, a nun was often told she could only hope for improvement in the next life. Even in spaces supposedly dedicated to transcendence, women remained bound by invisible chains. The irony was thick. Religious imagery often celebrated women as symbols of devotion and sacrifice. Mothers who prayed endlessly for their children, wives who performed rituals for their husbands' spirits, nuns who renounced the world in piety. But these images masked the reality. Women's religious roles existed only in service to others. Their prayers were valued when directed toward men's success. Their sacrifices were praised when they benefited families or clans. Their own spiritual needs were secondary, often dismissed entirely. Religion also sanctioned brutal punishments. Accusations of sorcery or improper rituals could be used to justify exile or execution. A woman who studied certain texts or practiced folk healing might be branded a witch, her knowledge reframed as dangerous. In aristocratic courts, rival wives or concubines sometimes accused one another of using spells to sway a lord's favour. Such accusations could end careers, marriages, or lives. Spiritual suspicion became another weapon in the arsenal of control. And yet, despite this oppressive framework, women clung to their own forms of faith. They prayed to Canon, the Bodhisattva of mercy, believed to hear the cries of women in distress. They left offerings for Jizo statues, hoping to secure peace for lost children. They invented small rituals of resistance, whispering prayers for their own survival even when told to pray only for husbands and sons, creating folk practices that blended Shinto and Buddhism with older, hidden traditions. These quiet acts remind us that even when religion pressed down hardest, women found ways to carve tiny spaces of agency. Still, the larger picture was one of confinement. Shrines and temples should have been places of comfort, but instead they reinforced subordination. Doctrines painted women's suffering as karmic debt, their bodies as polluted vessels, their roles as servants of men's spiritual progress. Religion, rather than offering escape, locked the chains tighter. So when you think of feudal Japan's serene temples, their wooden halls echoing with chanting monks and the scent of incense, remember the women standing outside the gates. Remember the widows forced into convents, the wives excluded from rituals for their supposed impurity, the daughters told their prayers meant less because they were born female. Behind the tranquil facade, religion was another blade pressed against their throats, another voice whispering that obedience was divine and suffering inevitable. If the lives of samurai wives and concubines were suffocating under the weight of politics and ritual, the lives of peasant women were defined by relentless toil. Forget silks, perfumes, or gilded palaces. Your world was mud, sweat, and aching bones. For most women in feudal Japan, survival meant unending labour from dawn until dusk, with little recognition and no respite. If you were born into a farming family, you were born into work, and you would work until your body gave out. Picture a rice paddy in midsummer. The sun beats down, hot enough to sting your skin, the air thick with insects buzzing in your ears. You're ankle deep in muddy water, planting seedlings row by row. Your back curves, your legs ache, but you cannot stop. Alongside you, your husband and brothers labour too, but when their tasks are done, they may rest or drink. When yours end in the fields, a second shift begins. Cooking, cleaning, tending children, fetching water, spinning thread, weaving cloth, and serving your in-laws. A peasant woman's day stretched far beyond the field. Her home was no sanctuary, only another workplace. Seasonal rhythms dictated your life. In spring, you planted rice seedlings, often balancing an infant on your hip while you worked. In summer, you weeded the paddies, bent double in the mud for hours, leeches clinging to your ankles. Autumn meant harvest, carrying heavy bundles of rice stalks across your shoulders, your back screaming under the load. Winter was no reprieve. It was the season of spinning and weaving, producing textiles to sell or to pay taxes. Work followed you year-round, and the rare moments of rest were stolen, not granted. On top of agricultural labour came domestic drudgery. A peasant woman rose before sunrise to light fires, cook millet or rice gruel, and prepare tools for her husband. She fetched water from wells or rivers, carrying heavy buckets balanced on poles across her shoulders. She washed clothes in icy streams during winter, her hands raw and cracked. She ground grain, chopped vegetables, and brewed weak tea, often eating last after her family had finished. Her life was service layered upon service without complaint, because complaint itself was considered disobedience. Childbearing did not pause this cycle. A peasant woman might give birth in the corner of her home, aided by a midwife or neighbour, and return to the fields within days. There was no time for recovery, crops did not wait, taxes did not relent, and in-laws did not accept excuses. Mothers strapped newborns to their backs and trudged into the fields, their children rocked to sleep by the sway of their labour. Infant mortality was high, but grief could not stop the work. Even mourning was a luxury many could not afford. Taxes loomed constantly. The Tokugawa shogunate demanded rice levies from farmers, regardless of whether harvests succeeded or failed. If crops withered from floods, droughts, or pests, tax collectors still arrived. Men might negotiate or plead, but it was often women who bore the hidden costs. They stretched meals thinner, sold woven goods, or pawned personal belongings to cover shortfalls. In some regions, families even sold daughters to brothels to pay debts. Women were forced to sacrifice their own children for the survival of the household. The cruelty of the system rested heavily on their shoulders. The social hierarchy reinforced their subjugation. Peasant women occupied the lowest rungs beneath samurai, merchants, and artisans. They were expected to be humble, deferential, and endlessly productive. A woman who lagged in her duties might be ridiculed by neighbours, punished by her husband, or shamed by village elders. Gossip policed behaviour as effectively as any law. The community itself enforced obedience, making rebellion nearly impossible. Violence was not absent. Husbands or fathers-in-law could punish women physically for perceived failures. Striking a wife was not seen as cruelty but as correction, necessary to keep the household in order. A woman who resisted or fled could be dragged back by neighbours, her disobedience considered a threat to communal harmony. Imagine the isolation of knowing that not only your family but your entire village would side against you if you dared to protest. Education was almost non-existent. While samurai daughters might learn calligraphy or poetry, peasant girls learned only what was needed for survival: cooking, weaving, planting, and submission. Literacy rates among peasant women were abysmally low. Few could read or write. Their knowledge was practical, not scholarly. The idea of personal development, of expanding horizons, was unheard of. Their lives were narrowed deliberately, confined to chores that kept them dependent. And yet, their labour underpinned the entire feudal system. The rice they grew fed the samurai, filled the storehouses, and funded the shogunate. Without peasant women's hands planting, harvesting, and weaving, the structure of feudal Japan would have collapsed. They were the invisible foundation of society, exploited yet unacknowledged. Men wrote the codes, wielded the swords, and claimed the glory. Women bent their backs in silence, sustaining a world that denied them recognition. There were moments of fleeting community among women. In the fields they sometimes sang work songs, their voices weaving together as they bent to plant seedlings. At rivers, washing clothes, they shared whispered complaints and brief laughter. These moments did not erase suffering, but they offered glimpses of solidarity in a world designed to isolate them. A joke about a lazy husband, a shared eye roll at a mother-in-law's nagging. Tiny rebellions quickly buried under silence. Still, the cycle ground on. As girls, they learned from their mothers to fetch water and pound rice. As wives, they toiled under in-laws and bore children. As widows, they often carried households alone, with sons or village elders assuming control of property. Old age did not bring rest. Elderly women spun thread, mended clothes, and watched grandchildren, Their bodies bent permanently from years of labour. Death was sometimes the only release, their graves marked with simple stones, their names quickly forgotten. If samurai wives were pawns in politics, peasant women were the beasts of burden that kept the machine turning. Their lives were not romantic or ceremonial, but grinding, endless toil. They had no luxury of retreat, no silk screens to hide behind, no illusions of status. Their suffering was raw, constant, and inescapable. So when you picture the rice terraces of Japan, curving beautifully up mountainsides, don't just admire their elegance. Imagine the women knee-deep in muck, infants strapped to their backs, sweat running into their eyes as they bent to plant each stalk. Imagine the cracked hands, the weary smiles forced for family, the whispered prayers for relief that never came. Their lives were not written in chronicles, but their labour fed an entire nation, and in that silence their suffering remains one of the most unspeakable truths of feudal Japan. If daily life for women in feudal Japan was already harsh, the punishments awaiting those accused of dishonour or crime were terrifying. The codes of the warrior class, the expectations of villages, and the doctrines of Confucian morality all reinforced the idea that a woman's misstep was more than a personal failing. It was a stain on her family's honour, and by extension, a threat to the social order. Where men might be fined, exiled, or even forgiven for comparable behaviour, women often paid with brutal humiliation, beatings, or death. Infidelity was the most feared accusation. A wife suspected of cheating on her husband, whether evidence existed or not, could face lethal consequences. Among the samurai class, a woman's fidelity was considered inseparable from family honour. A rumour that a wife had been seen speaking too warmly with another man could be enough to ignite suspicion. Punishment ranged from beatings to execution, and executions were sometimes carried out by the husband himself, sanctioned under samurai law. It wasn't uncommon for a wife accused of infidelity to be forced into jigai, the female form of ritual suicide, cutting her throat while her legs were bound so her body would remain dignified after death. Meanwhile, samurai husbands openly kept concubines and visited pleasure quarters without fear of disgrace. This double standard wasn't a secret. It was written into the very fabric of the law. Male privilege was celebrated, female fidelity demanded at sword point. A man's affairs were political or pleasurable. A woman's imagined indiscretion was treason. Punishments extended beyond issues of fidelity. Theft, gossip, disobedience, offences that might earn a man a reprimand were sometimes grounds for severe corporal punishment for women. Husbands or fathers-in-law could beat women with bamboo rods, lock them in storerooms without food, or confine them in isolation for days. Such punishments were not considered cruelty but discipline, reinforcing the idea that a woman's body was her family's property to control. Execution methods for women differed from those for men, but they carried their own particular horror. Men of the samurai class often faced beheading or seppuku, seen as honourable deaths. Women, considered too impure for such rites, were frequently strangled or hanged. Hanging was seen as appropriate because it spilled less blood, preserving the illusion of female modesty even in death. The symbolism was grotesque. Society that denied women dignity in life insisted on dignity in execution, twisting modesty into another form of control. Public humiliation often preceded these deaths. A woman accused of poisoning her husband, for example, might be paraded through the streets before being executed, a spectacle meant to terrify other wives into obedience. Some were forced to wear placards describing their crimes, enduring jeers and stones from neighbours as they were marched to the gallows. Their punishment was not just physical annihilation but social erasure, turning them into examples of shame. Among commoners, punishments could be equally harsh. A peasant woman accused of theft or gossip might be beaten publicly by village elders, her hair cut short in disgrace. Cutting hair was symbolic. Long, well-kept hair represented femininity and virtue. Shaving or hacking it off marked her as tainted, a warning for all who saw her. Even if she survived, the stigma followed her for life, whispered about at markets, used as justification to exclude her from community support. Some codes permitted execution for women accused of more serious crimes, even if men guilty of the same offence were spared. A wife suspected of plotting against her husband could be strangled on nothing more than hearsay. Even daughters were not immune. Girls accused of dishonouring their families, through disobedience, Inappropriate behaviour, or simply being caught alone with a boy, could be beaten severely or forced into convents as punishment. Exile to a convent might sound merciful compared to execution, but in reality it was social death, cutting a girl off from her family forever. Honour killings were another grim reality. Families sometimes killed daughters or sisters themselves if their behaviour was seen as dishonourable. A girl caught in a forbidden romance could be strangled by her own relatives, who would later describe the act as a duty. Society praised such killings as acts of loyalty to family honour, reinforcing the idea that women's lives were expendable tools in the preservation of male prestige. Even accidents could spiral into accusations. If a woman was seen laughing too loudly at a festival, neighbours might whisper about impropriety. If she lingered too long fetching water, rumours could bloom into allegations of infidelity. The community's surveillance meant that women lived under constant threat, not only from husbands or in-laws but from the collective judgment of the village itself. A misinterpreted smile could, in extreme cases, end a life. The state itself codified these disparities. Samurai law codes like the Bukushohato reinforced men's authority, leaving women with no avenues for justice. Village law similarly upheld patriarchal control, framing men as heads of households with the right to discipline wives and daughters. Religious justifications layered on top of this. Buddhism painted female suffering as karmic retribution, while Confucianism declared obedience the highest female virtue. The result was a system where punishment was not an aberration, but an expectation, a built-in part of the machinery of control. The psychological impact of living under such threats was immense. Imagine being a wife who knew that even an unkind glance from a mother-in-law might spark accusations of infidelity. Imagine being a daughter whose laughter was scrutinized for signs of impropriety. Imagine living every day aware that your family could legally and socially punish you, that your life was balanced precariously on their perception of your virtue. Every gesture, every word, every look was weighed and measured. The constant surveillance turned ordinary existence into a minefield. Even children were not spared from these lessons. Young girls grew up hearing stories of women punished for disobedience or dishonour. Mothers and grandmothers drilled into them the importance of silence, humility, and obedience. These warnings weren't abstract, they were survival manuals. A daughter who absorbed them might avoid punishment later. A daughter who didn't could be shamed, beaten, or worse. From the earliest age, fear was a teacher, and yet the cruelty was masked under the rhetoric of virtue. Manuals and moral texts describe punishments as necessary corrections, meant to guide women back to proper behaviour. A wife beaten for disobedience was told to accept the blows as instruction. A daughter confined for impropriety was told it was for her own good. This reframing of violence as education normalised the suffering, making women themselves internalise the idea that their pain was deserved. But behind the rhetoric, the reality was simple. Punishment in feudal Japan was gendered, brutal, and deeply unjust. Men's mistakes were flaws, women's were crimes. Men's indiscretions were tolerated, women's were executed. The system demanded obedience and enforced it with terror, stripping women not only of rights but of safety in their own homes and communities. So when you think of samurai law codes, village councils and religious doctrines, remember the women who bore the brunt of their enforcement. Remember the wives executed for imagined affairs, the daughters shamed for laughter, the peasants beaten for gossip. Their punishments were not rare spectacles but routine mechanisms of control. Their suffering was unspeakable not because it was hidden, but because it was normalized, accepted, and perpetuated as if it were justice. Education in feudal Japan was a privilege tightly rationed, and for women, it was often little more than a shadow of the opportunities afforded to men. Where boys might learn reading, writing, arithmetic, and the intricacies of Confucian classics, girls were taught silence, obedience, and the bare minimum of skills deemed useful for managing a household. Knowledge for women was not seen as a path to independence or self-expression, but as a way to refine their ability to serve husbands and uphold family honour. To be educated as a woman was to be polished into a tool, never sharpened into a mind of your own. Among the samurai class, girls did receive some form of instruction, but it was tightly framed by expectation. A samurai daughter might be taught to read and copy simple texts, often moral guides like the Onna Daigaku, Greater Learning for Women. This infamous book outlined in painstaking detail how a woman should behave: humble, obedient, deferential, and grateful for correction. Its lessons were not intellectual sparks, but chains, drilled into girls so deeply they became second nature. Instead of asking questions, they learned to bow. Instead of speaking boldly, they learned to whisper. Instead of forming opinions, they memorized the virtues of servitude. Education also extended to the arts, but always within narrow bounds. Samurai daughters might learn to compose tanka poetry, practice calligraphy, or play the koto or shamisen. These skills were never meant to enrich their inner lives, they were marriage currency. A girl who could write a delicate poem or strum a graceful tune was more appealing to a potential husband, proof that she could entertain guests and uphold the dignity of her household. The arts polished her like lacquerware, ornamental, admired from the outside, hollowed of personal expression. For peasant women, even these small scraps of learning were often out of reach. Their education came from necessity: how to plant rice, how to spin thread, how to carry water, how to obey fathers and husbands. A peasant girl rarely saw written texts. If she learned anything of literacy, it might come from overhearing boys in temple schools or snatching glimpses of prayers scribbled on votive plaques. Her world was practical survival, not intellectual expansion. And yet, she too absorbed moral lessons. The village gossiped about disobedient women, elders scolded girls who spoke too freely, mothers reminded daughters that their worth lay in quiet labour. The village itself was her school, and its curriculum was obedience. Merchant and artisan families in cities like Edo, Osaka, or Kyoto sometimes gave daughters rudimentary literacy, especially if they were expected to help in business. A girl might learn to read account books, tally figures, or write letters. But this too was framed as service. She was not encouraged to think beyond the ledger. If she learned to write, her pen was tied to her family's shop, not to her own voice. Ambition beyond that was considered dangerous, even shameful. The fear of women's education ran deep. Men believed that literacy and learning might encourage rebellion, making wives less obedient or daughters more difficult to marry off. A woman who read widely might begin to question why her husband could keep concubines while she was punished for even talking to another man. She might notice that religious texts declared her impure yet demanded her offerings. She might see the contradiction in being praised for endurance while denied recognition. Better, the system thought, to keep her ignorant. Better to let her world shrink to kitchens and weaving looms than risk her glimpsing the hypocrisy outside. Even in temples and convents, education was limited. Nuns might learn to copy sutras or chant prayers, but their literacy was functional, not expansive. They were still told that enlightenment required rebirth as men, that their minds could not reach the same heights. Religious instruction often reinforced submission rather than inspiring thought. Instead of being liberated by study, women were reminded that every character they copied was another tether to obedience. The rare exceptions stand out because they were so unusual. A handful of women from elite families left diaries or poetry that survived. Writers like Lady Nijo, centuries earlier, or later women in samurai households who kept journals, offer glimpses of inner worlds otherwise erased. Their words speak of longing, jealousy, despair, and fleeting joys, human emotions that the system tried to deny them. But these voices are few, fragile threads in a tapestry otherwise woven with silence. Their rarity highlights how thoroughly most women's thoughts were suppressed. The cultural pressure to restrict women's education also extended into beauty rituals and household training. Girls were drilled in etiquette: how to kneel correctly, how to pour tea without spilling, how to fold clothing, how to serve elders. This was their curriculum. Instead of classrooms, they had kitchens. Instead of lessons, they had constant correction. A girl's schooling was essentially rehearsal for servitude, ensuring she could step seamlessly into marriage without resistance. And the consequences of stepping outside these boundaries were severe. A woman who showed too much curiosity, who read unauthorized texts or spoke too boldly, could be branded as improper. Neighbors might whisper about her arrogance, in-laws might complain about her behavior, and a husband could even use her disobedience as grounds for divorce. Knowledge was not just discouraged, it was dangerous. It risked a woman's place in her family and community. This deliberate suppression robbed women of intellectual growth, but it also robbed society of their contributions. Imagine the innovations lost, the poems unwritten, the philosophies unexplored, because women were barred from education. Imagine the grief of a bright girl who longed to learn but was told that her duty was to cook rice and bear children. Her questions silenced, her spark dimmed, her potential wasted, not because she lacked ability, but because the system feared it. The tragedy was that even when women did learn, their achievements were often erased. A woman might keep household accounts with meticulous skill, yet credit went to her husband. She might compose poems, yet they were signed with her family's name or dismissed as trifles. She might manage an entire estate in her husband's absence, yet her efforts were described as his success. Women's education, when it existed, became invisible, swallowed by men's narratives. For most, then, education was not a door to opportunity but a wall that boxed them in. It taught them how to serve, not how to think. It polished their obedience, not their voices. It was never meant to empower but to entrap. So when you imagine the schools of feudal Japan, boys reciting Confucian maxims, monks chanting sutras, merchants' sons tallying rice accounts, remember the girls outside those rooms. Remember the daughters practicing tea etiquette instead of arithmetic, the peasant girls bent in rice paddies instead of reading scrolls, the wives told that silence was the highest form of wisdom. Their lack of education was not accidental. It was deliberate, designed to keep them in shadows. And in those shadows, an entire half of Japan's potential was left to wither, unacknowledged and unspeakably wasted. And now, as our journey through the darker corners of feudal Japan comes to an end, let the heavy images begin to dissolve. The castles with their locked gates, the narrow streets of Yoshiwara, the endless rice fields, all of it softens, fading into the distance until it feels less like memory and more like mist. Breathe slowly. Imagine yourself stepping away from those places, out of the corridors where every word was judged, out of the fields where every step was labour. Walk into a wide, open night where no one demands, no one watches, and no one controls you. The air is cool, touched with the scent of pine and earth after rain. The only sound is water flowing gently in the dark. Look upward, and the lanterns go out one by one, leaving only a sky full of stars. The weight of history falls quiet. The fears and punishments that bound women so tightly are no longer present here. The walls, the whispers, the duties, they melt into silence, and the silence is kind. Now you are sitting beneath cherry trees, petals drifting around you like soft snow. Each petal lands lightly, reminding you that everything passes, even sorrow. You breathe in, you breathe out, and the centuries of suffering slip away with the wind. Let your body loosen, shoulders soften, thoughts lengthen, and the rhythm of your breath steadies. You're not in those stories. You're here, in this calm. You're free to rest, free to let go. So tonight, let history settle into silence. Let the women's voices once silenced rest too, and let yourself drift, gently and safely, into sleep.